register on the Pennsylvania sex offender registry. At our inaugural event last year, we examined the potential impact of the landmark cases of Elaine versus United States and Apprendi versus New Jersey that they may have on the ongoing Commonwealth versus Torcelleri case. The archive of this event is available at the PARSOL YouTube page. Almost a year later, we are still eagerly awaiting the opinion of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court in this matter. This evening's focus is treatment models and advocacy for one's own care. Our esteemed guest will enlighten us with research on effective treatment methods. At this time, allow me to introduce your host, John Daw, our Managing Director for Some Announcements and Logistics. I hope you'll enjoy tonight's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Josiah, and welcome everyone. We're so excited to welcome you here tonight. Before we get started on the actual program stuff, I want to remind everyone we have a ton of stuff going on this month. You may have seen some of the information fly by on the intro slides. This Sunday, we have a lobbying and advocacy training. This coming Monday to Wednesday, some of us will be at the Criminal Justice Advisory Board Conference in State College. If you're in the area, hit us up. We'll grab coffee or a meal. Next Saturday, so not tomorrow, Saturday after, at 4 p.m. is our Pennsylvania Fearless Support Group, which has a 12-step inspired meeting for persons to register and people with crimes of a sexual nature, their families, to get support. Then Tuesday the 16th, we are having our inaugural book club featuring a book by my friend Congresswoman Madeline Dean that she wrote with her son Harry Canan called Under Our Roof, A Son's Battle for Recovery and a Mother's Battle for Her Son. A great book that may relate to some of us, and we just learned that is available as an audio book included in Spotify Premium. So if you have Spotify Premium, you can listen to that. And then finally, Tuesday, April 30th, it's our spring lobbying day in Harrisburg. We hope anyone in Pennsylvania who can make it will join us on site at the Capitol. We have made some amazing inroads with certain members of our electorate in the state House and Senate. And now we're trying to take that out one more level. So hopefully folks can join us there. Information about all of this is going to be posted in the Zoom chat. Maybe I can do that. There we go. So you can click on the link I just posted for more information. All right. Before we turn things over to Dr. Weeks, just have a couple quick questions that everyone can answer. The first question is going to be, what area are you from if you're in Pennsylvania or outside? And that's going to pop up on your screen now. So take a minute to make your selection. Oh, sorry, I hit the wrong one. Here we go. There we go. Another couple seconds here. All righty. And we'll put up on the screen here. I think you can see. There we go. That is where we're from. This is helpful for us to get some of these demographics, and of course for Dr. Weeks to know who she's presenting to. All right. And then the next question is, do you, let's see, back to the screen. We'll come back to that. Does everybody have access to the raise hand button on Zoom? Okay. I see heads nodding. So just so you know, we have some folks who are forced to register, forced to or compelled to do mandatory treatment programs. We have family members and friends. We have other treatment providers. We have members of law enforcement and probation officers who want to know a little bit more from an expert on how to work with their constituents. And we have some folks in the legal profession here as well. So we've got a pretty diverse crowd. We've got 27 people on as of right now, which is a wonderful audience here for our presenter. Before I go on, I just need to share a couple safety considerations. We're asking all participants to avoid sharing websites, search terms, and specifics about any illegal activities you may have engaged in that may lead others to follow in your footsteps. In fact, please do not disclose any illegal activity you may have engaged in or are aware of. That makes everyone present aware of criminal activity, as some of us are obligated to report activity to the authorities. And for the safety of all participants, all are asked to submit their questions via Zoom chat. Zoom chat is limited to sending to the moderators, which are me and Josiah. I'm John. Please send any questions that you may have for Dr. Weeks to me in the Zoom chat, and I will compile a list and we'll come back to those questions. Dr. Weeks can pause for questions, or we can wait till the end of the presentation. And speaking of Dr. Jennifer Weeks, she's the founder and director of Sexual Addiction Treatment Services, which is an outpatient treatment program for out-of-control sexual behavior. She has almost 20 years of experience treating individuals who commit sex crimes and all aspects of addiction, trauma, and sexual addiction. She's a certified sex addiction therapist supervisor, certified advanced alcohol and drug counselor, a licensed professional counselor, and clinically certified sex offender treatment specialist. She's a recognized expert witness in the forensics specialty of sex offenders and sexual compulsivity, and she provides expert testimony in both county and federal courts. And I am thrilled to say that she is also a huge supporter of PARSOL and the work that we do on behalf of people forced to register and individuals who have a history of sex crimes and fighting for our rights. And I think that's a big part of her presentation tonight. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Weeks. And Dr. Weeks, I will give you screen share permission for your PowerPoint, and we'll turn it over to you. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, now I can unmute myself. All right. So you want me to share from mine and we'll go from there? Okay. Dun, dun, dun. Slideshow from the beginning. Sorry, guys. It's been a really long week. So thank you, everybody. You can all hear me? We're good? Okay. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you all on this topic. I don't know when Josiah asked me if I wanted to come talk about treatment and things like that, if he knew he was going to kind of get an ethics and document heavy talk, but that's what he's getting. And I will explain some of that, but I also absolutely want to leave time for for you guys with questions or whatever you may have. John had tossed me some questions that I added towards the end, and he already actually sent me an email from one of you all that had some questions on it. So if I don't hit those questions while I talk, please make sure you poke John there and say, make sure I get that question taken care of. All right, so I'm going to start and just say what we're talking about today is treatment for sexual offending behavior. And did notice on that poll that some folks are not in Pennsylvania, so I also absolutely want to say that particularly when we're talking about SOAP treatment guidelines, these are the Pennsylvania guidelines. So if you are somewhere else, if you're somewhere else in the country, you need to look at whatever your states are guidelines are. So
Yeah,
here's the overview.
we're having a little bit of audio issue with you.
Okay.
It's saying that it's a little loud on your end. I'm not sure if
Okay.
you can switch your microphone setting, or maybe
Let me-
just sit a little.
Better, not better.
Let's see. Let me ask you to, I'm going to send you a direct chat with a number. Maybe you can call in and use audio from your phone if that's all right.
Okay.
Sorry, folks. This is
Oh, that's all right. So hey, John, do you want to just try it again with the audio on the Zoom?
Yeah, let's try that, and we'll just kind of muddle through here.
Sorry about that. Yeah, it's not letting me unmute. I am from New Jersey, so I apologize. I am kind of loud. So I'll try to tone it down. So the four things that I really want to talk about today that I think might be helpful for people advocating for their own treatment rights are the SOAB treatment guidelines, again, for Pennsylvania, because again, anyone who is providing treatment for individuals who've committed a sex crime, most probation officers are going to make you go to a SOAB approved treatment provider. We kind of got away with that for a while, that, you know, some probation officers would send folks to us before we were SOAB approved, but that's uncommon. And I'm going to tweak my audio while I talk, so I hope that's going to be okay. All right, I'm gonna push myself down. Every one of you who are going to a treatment provider are also seeing someone who is working under the guides of some kind of state licensing board, right? So whether they're a licensed professional counselor, whether it's a psychologist or a licensed social worker, we all have ethical guidelines, state ethical guidelines that we have to follow in order to be within our boards, you know, with our board's practice and to be giving ethical therapy. ATSA is the Association for the Treatment and Prevention of Sexual Abuse. It's an international organization that kind of provides evidence-based practice. They have fantastic conferences. They are kind of the cutting edge of research for sexual offending behaviors and things like that. Do a lot of evidence-based practice. I know your PARSOL board is familiar with a lot of their standards and guidelines for treatment practice. And the last thing I do want to talk about is the risk needs responsivity model, which is a newer, more evidence-based practice way of looking at how we determine risk, determine treatment needs, and then we determine sort of how to provide treatment for people. myself. All right. I think, and we're not going to get into the deep philosophical question here, but I do want folks to understand that there is this question, right, in the treatment community when we're working with folks who are forced or mandated to treatment about who's the client, right? You know, if you are being forced, you are, you know, probation is saying you have to go as a term or condition of your supervised release, you're being forced to go as part of the, you know, court mandate, you're still the client, right? It gets into a gray area sometimes in terms of who's paying, who's the client. But what I want to say fundamentally, and this is my perspective on this, and other treatment providers might have a different perspective on this, is that I am first and foremost a mental health professional, right? I am a licensed professional counselor and I have an ethics board. That means I have to follow those. So when someone comes into me for treatment, mandated or not mandated, they get a registration information, they get an informed consent, right? That they read just like any other client who's coming in who's not mandated. And that person is my client. Probation is not my client. The sub board is not my client. The person sitting in my office that I'm doing therapy with is my client. When it is a mandated treatment setting, we do that collaboratively, but ultimately, and I think you'll see my philosophy will sort of bleed through in the that you are the client, the person getting the therapy is the client, but we do this in this collaborative process. So again, just, you know, this is these questions that maybe you guys have had yourself about this process. There are people that are thinking about these things and trying to figure out what are the ethics in this situation. All right, so I'm going to start out with the SOAP treatment provider guidelines. I do want to completely acknowledge that this is not everything. I've pulled excerpts of things that might be useful for us in our discussion. These are all available online. So if you want the full standards, you can go on the SOAP website and you will see all of that. So by SOAP statement, and they talk about the section about the predators, because that's in order to treat someone who's been designated an SVP or has an SVP status, you have to follow these guidelines. But basically, all SOAP approved treatment providers need to follow these guidelines. So, why are you in treatment according to SOAP? Someone mandated treatment for these reasons is there impact how the person accept full responsibility and accountability for their behavior, to help them identify, you know, problematic sexual behavior, learn how to control that, learn our triggers.
Now, there are more than
I'm going to
20
interrupt
participants
just a
in
quick
the meeting.
second.
This
We're
meeting
still
is
having
being
some
recorded.
audio issues. So Jen, I'm going to call you and patch you in that way. All right. Thank you.
Good to go? I think I got a thumbs up from some folks, so thank you.
There we go. Thank you.
Yay, thank you. Whoever is giving me clapping and thumbs up, I appreciate it. Okay. So I hope everybody heard that. So again, these are the treatment provider guidelines that, for folks who are in that mandated treatment, this is what SOAB wants us to be working on. Sure this is working. All right, so again, I pulled out some of the things that I thought would be appropriate. This is not all of them. So what are we supposed to be doing, right? So when somebody comes in, these are the principles of treatment. When a client comes into treatment, into a mandated treatment situation, into, our practice, according to SOAB, they need to be doing a comprehensive assessment. So using objective techniques consistent with or equivalent to polygraphs, objective measures of sexual interest. There was a question earlier about, should clients be getting assessments like the look or the able? Yes, according to SOAB standards, we actually have to be able to provide that to our clients and have that as part of our assessment. We should also be able to be assessing for drug and alcohol issues. We should be assessing for other mental health issues. Our comprehensive assessments also include obviously looking at, victim statements, looking at any of the discovery or the information from law enforcement, right? So when someone comes in as that intake assessment, we should be looking at all of these things, and there should hopefully be some objective testing in there. So it's probably not going to be the same depth of somebody who, say, gets an independent psychosexual evaluation pretrial that's got, mountains and hours of testing, but we should be giving some objective assessments, and that should also include some objective measure for sexual arousal. Other things we should be, community treatment needs to be collaborative, right? So this means that if you're coming to me for treatment, we're signing a release of information so that we can talk to your probation or parole officer if you are under supervision. And we do that in a collaborative process. And that, again, is a SOAB principle, that we're all working together in order to try to achieve all of these treatment goals. So treatment and supervision, and this is their statement, require parties to be appropriately intrusive and confrontive, directly asserting the relative issues in a respectful manner. So I think that sometimes gets interpreted differently by different people, but sort of when I read that, it means that we all need to be working together, probation, parole, and treatment providers, to be providing the best treatment that we can and to help people achieve the SOAB-related goals, as well as, whatever their personal goals are for therapy. All right, other principles, and this comes down to selection, and I know some people struggled with this as well. Selection of a community-based treatment program for someone on probation or parole rests with the probation or parole officials, not with the person who has engaged in the offending. And so I do know that every probation and parole kind of deals with this differently. We have some places that we work with where they'll say, call this program. We have other counties that we work with that will say, here's a list of all of the SOAB approved providers. You pick where you want to go. And so, technically this is often something that is dictated by probation or parole. You have the opportunity, if there are multiple SOAB approved treatment providers in your geographic area, you can ask, right? Can we go to X, Y, or Z program? Where you don't really have a choice necessarily is for someone who's coming out of state prison and the Department of Corrections is paying for your treatment. If DOC is paying for treatment, you have to go to a DOC approved provider, which is a separate approval than the SOAB. So sometimes that can limit the options you have for where you can go for treatment, because not every SOAB approved provider is also approved by the Department of Corrections. I hope that makes sense. We have a lot of acronyms. Treatment providers, we also have to recognize that clients have the right to change providers, right? So I can't keep you here because, again, this is a therapeutic relationship.
you have to be, particularly for folks with an SVP designation, they have to see a SOAB approved provider. Most probation is going to require a SOAB approved provider, but again, you have the right to ask, right? So this is, if you're not vibing, if there's something going on, if there's a conflict, you can ask to change treatment providers. That doesn't always necessarily go very well for whatever reason, but that is something that you can, again, even by SOAB statute, you can change providers. And again, John, you're going to throw me chats if people have questions, right?
Right.
Okay. All right. I want to make sure I'm not jumping ahead because my buttons get a little sticky. All right. So this is about treatment planning and treatment. Again, these are SOAB principles. Our treatment that we are giving should be following best practice standards. SOAB is telling us, okay, here's our minimum best practice standards. We need to work to reduce the risk of recidivism. Treatment can be intrusive, investigative, and challenging, but it should also be respectful to the individual. This is written right in our standards. So it should be collaborative with all of the agencies involved. And we need to, as treatment providers, and I think this was also a question that was emailed, it should be individualized to who you are as a person and what your issues are. And you should be given an individualized treatment plan that kind of looks at, okay, here are all of my areas of risk or areas of concern. What are the treatment goals that I need to be working towards, whether that's homeworks or things like that. And so I can give you an example from our practice. We have this multi-page sheet where we look at each person that comes in. I like to use Michael Cito's motivation facilitation model of sexual offending behavior. So we'll look at, okay, are there motivational factors for the client to engage in this behavior? Is there, some kind of paraphilic behavior on board? Is there a high sex drive or sex addiction? What's the motivation? We need to account for that. We also look at facilitation factors. That could be substance abuse issues, mental health issues, any kind of other, gambling issues. What all is going on so that we can then create that individualized treatment plan for the person that is all of the SOAB specific issues, right? Understanding our relapse prevention, understanding our triggers, understanding our cycle, creating coping skills, creating emotion regulation, but also what else are we addressing? Okay, so I'm going to just take a break because I got a comment up here. 2022 U.S. Supreme Court case gave individuals required to seek treatment on demand Christian or other to demand Christian or other religious counseling. So John, as far as I know, it is not written in any of the SOAB standards that, anyone can specifically demand or seek religious-based counseling. I hope that answers your question. However, if that is something that someone wants, you would have to hopefully have a SOAB provider who is, let's say, for example, a Christian-based counselor. If not, and it's something very important to the individual that it be a religious-based treatment, that would be something you'd probably have to work out individually with probation and an outside treatment provider. I hope that answered the question. All right, so again, and this was a question that came from email, you should have a treatment plan, right? Anyone in mandated treatment, anyone in any kind of treatment should have a treatment plan. And not only should you have a treatment plan, but that treatment plan should be reviewed with you at least once a year so that you can assess your progress, right? What goals am I moving towards? What have I done? Where have I made progress? Where am I still struggling? What do I still need to work on? And, we can take things off the treatment plan as we have successfully completed them. Maybe other things need to be added. But again, SOAB standards say you should have a treatment plan that should be addressed or reviewed at least once a year. And a treatment plan is part of your medical record. You have a right to have that and to see that yourself. And I know sometimes we get questions about records. All right, so what kind of treatment, again, according to SOAB, should we be doing? Group counseling, right? Group counseling is really the evidence-based practice most folks are going to say you have to do group counseling. Sometimes folks aren't necessarily going to be a good fit for group counseling. We see this sometimes if we have individuals on the autism spectrum. Sometimes they can be in group without an issue. Sometimes, maybe, if you don't have an autism specific group, they're going to be a really good candidate for individual therapy. So again, that's looking at everyone as an individual saying, yes, the standard is group. Most people are going into group, but are there reasons maybe that someone would be better served with individual counseling? Cognitive behavior therapy is the main evidence-based practice. So we're looking at cognitive restructuring, values clarification, recognizing our offending behavior, identifying risk, enhancing coping, relapse prevention, victim awareness, affect control, emotion regulation, right? We do a lot of emotion regulation work in our practice, sexual education. We spend a lot of time with folks talking about sexuality, healthy sexuality. And again, if there's other things, substance abuse, mental health concerns, relationship issues, these are also things that should be, worked on or helped in an evidence-based fashion. All right. So again, you should have this individual treatment plan tailored to you, and it's going to integrate all of these collaborative things. This one's kind of a repetitive principle, so I'm not going to read that for you. So those are definitely not all of the SOAB standards and principles, but these are ones that I thought might be appropriate because we hear from people, is this the way we should be doing treatment? What should be being addressed in treatment? Do I get a treatment plan? Do I get to see that treatment plan? So the answer to all of that is kind of yes, yes, yes. I'm also going to give you a little note. So I attended last month my first mandatory treatment provider meeting since we got SOAB approved. And there were lots of things talked about and some of it were technical, but this part was really kind of interesting to me. And the head of SOAB framed this as sort of an ethics discussion, which I agree. And so she literally said, right, SOAB standards do not override your licensure standards, right? So what that means is that we should be providing treatment under those SOAB parameters within the ethical guidelines of our license. And I give you this quote, we are not in the business of yelling and screaming, is what she said. So, and I loved how she did this example, and I don't know if it was, I'm going to use eating disorders, but she said, if we had a group of people here that are in treatment for an eating disorder, group of folks struggling with an eating disorder, would we yell at them? Would we call them names? Would we belittle them? Would we do these things to them? And if we wouldn't do that to someone with an eating disorder, why would we do that to someone who's here because they committed a sex crime? So this is from the SOAB meeting, that abusive shaming tactics, yelling, screaming, name calling, and labeling are not therapeutic, which means we should not be doing this. And if someone reports you to your licensing board because you are a therapist engaging in therapy in this way, your licensing board is not going to say that this is okay. And so this was, I got lots of good tidbits in terms of logistics out of this meeting, but this to me felt really good, right? To have the head of the state board say, we're not supposed to be doing this. We don't do this in my practice. But this is the head of the board saying we're not supposed to be shaming people. We're not supposed to be, doing these things that we hear from clients that maybe are happening in some practices. So that's my segue into your therapist licensure. And again, I am not going to, I'm going to pull snippets, right, of some of the ethics because literally these are 100-page documents of ethics. If you are someone who is mandated to treatment, you should be seeing someone with some form of license. So that could be a licensed psychologist, and they work under the rules of the State Board of Psychology. They could be a licensed social worker, a licensed clinical social worker, a licensed professional counselor, or a licensed marriage and family counselor. And we are all under the PA Board of Social Workers, Marriage and Family Therapists, and Professional Counselors. So this, and you could Google these if you have, an interest in actually what the ethical guidelines are, but we should all be licensed. If you're at a program, they might have interns, they might have unlicensed people working towards licensure. They should always be supervised by someone with a license. But that also means that we all have ethics boards. So you should have licensed folks treating you. So I'm going to pull the LPC, the Licensed Professional Counselor Ethics, because that is what I am. And again, so in the state of Pennsylvania, the LPC ethics, they use the American Counseling Association ethical guidelines. Again, I'm pulling snippets. This is a 100-page document or so. And again, these are our ethics that we have to practice. We have to abide by SOAB principles, but under our ethical mandate. The primary responsibility of a counselor is to respect the dignity and promote the welfare of their clients. That is A1A. That is the first piece of information in our ethics documents. I pulled this one out because I thought it was interesting, that from the American Counseling Association, if we have mandated clients, so mandated client counselors, this is any of us who treat people who probation or parole is telling them they have to come. We have to discuss the required limitations to confidentiality. We have to explain what type of information and with whom that is shared prior to the beginning of counseling. Clients can choose to refuse services, right? Counselors, we have to, to the best of our ability, discuss the potential consequences of refusing counseling services. And I think this is, again, a struggle of what do we do if, right? So the other piece to remember is that if you are mandated to counseling, you're going to whatever practice. These are all independent businesses, right? We are all our own businesses. We all have our own business practices and ways that we do business. So, you have if you come to my practice and I say, okay, here's our rules and regs, here's our guidelines, here's how we do things, you have the right to say, I don't like that. I don't want to come see you. We'd have to sort of let you know what the consequences of that are, right? We can refer you to another treatment provider. If there are no other treatment providers, this is where things can get a little sticky because you have to be in treatment. If no one is willing to, if you don't want to abide by the rules and regs of some of the treatment providers, what do we do? And that's probably a bigger conversation. But I do want to point out that, if we're working with mandated folks, we really actually do need to be talking to you about, here's what we're talking about. We send monthly reports to probation officers. That's part of what we have to do. We talk to our clients about what is going to be in that monthly report. We just, not every time we send it, but when they come in, we let them know we have to send monthly reports to probation. This is the type of information from your sessions or from your groups that will be in that monthly report to your probation so that you have an awareness of what it is. You sign a release, so we have the legal ability to do that, but you also have an awareness of what it is, what information we are talking, providing to them. Hope that makes sense. Other things that might be relevant from some of the scuttlebutt I've heard lately from the ACA ethical guidelines. When as counselors, we are working in situations that we don't think are appropriate, or we're seeing things going on in our practice that we don't think are appropriate, it's our job to report that. So counselors should be reporting to their employers or alert their employers to inappropriate policies or practices. They want us to attempt to effect changes in a constructive way. When such policies are potentially disruptive or damaging to clients or may limit the effectiveness of services provided and change cannot be effected, we should take appropriate further action, which maybe is referral to an appropriate, appropriately accredited place. Do we report things to the state licensure organizations? And sometimes this means we end up having to quit our jobs if we don't agree with ethically what the company is doing that we're working for. So even the ACA says, as therapists, we should be aware when things are not being done ethically, and we should do something about that. And if we can't do something about that, say by going to our employer, or going to a supervisor, perhaps, and if it's an egregious violation, maybe that does go to the state licensure organization and we can report that. And In terms of reporting, counselors are not the only ones who can report that. Clients, if they feel like the counselor that they're seeing is violating ethical guidelines, can also make reports to licensing organizations. Counselors are not supposed to harass their colleagues or employees or fire them if they have acted in a responsible or ethical manner to expose inappropriate employer policies or practices. So this is, I think, the ACA's kind of whistleblower guidelines, that if you do say, hey, I don't think what's going on in this group or in this practice is an ethical thing, I have a problem with it, can we change it? And you get fired, that is, again, not an appropriate ethical counseling practice. Hope this is all making sense. And like I said, so I literally just pulled a couple of paragraphs from what is, I think, a 93-page document to talk about, based on some things that kind of I've heard from the PARSOL folks. If you really want to know what our ethical practices are, again, this is all a Google search away. You can email my practice. We can get you those links. Because again, even if it's a mandated client experience, you are still the client. You still have rights as a therapy client. And I think that's kind of what I'm pounding in everybody's head today, at least I hope. Okay, moving on from ACA to ATSA. ATSA has treatment guidelines. Again, if you go on the ATSA.com website, they have the treatment guidelines for treating adult men. ATSA membership is a voluntary thing. It is not a mandatory thing. Many of us are ATSA members, again, because we get access to the latest scientific data and the most up-to-date evidence-based practices. So those of us that are ATSA providers, we also follow this guideline, where we provide and support ethically sound and empirically informed assessment, treatment, and interventions for people who engage in sexual offending behavior that reflects the needs and interests both of victims and the community, but also the person that we're treating, and to abide by those. So again, the ATSA treatment guidelines that we provide service to and interact with individuals who engage in sexual offending, their victims, and their families in a humane and respectful manner, focusing on a positive therapeutic relationship by demonstrating research-supportive therapist characteristics. And what that is, I don't know if anyone is a research geek like I am. When you look at just general counseling, somewhere around 60% of what accounts for all therapeutic change in any kind of treatment is your relationship with your therapist, right? It's not necessarily the type of therapy, but if you have a really good, solid connection with your therapist, odds are you're going to improve because of that connection. So, we should be respectful. We should be open and empathetic, firm but fair, right? And, looking at reinforcing behaviors and not being just always sort of wagging our fingers and being punitive. We should be up to date on research practices and, kind of just acknowledge everyone in this process. Again, we're looking at individualized assessment-driven treatment. So again, testing assessments on an individual basis and develop your treatment plans based on your individualized assessments, written treatment plans, specific goals, right? We got SMART goals, specific, measurable, things that we can say, yes, you're done, to move you towards like graduation from treatment. And we routinely review and update these treatment plans with people. So treatment is a very fluid process, right? Like the goals we start treatment with are not usually the goals that we have in mid, because we've grown and we've improved and, new struggles come, and that treatment plan is a very fluid document that is always kind of changing. So members offer treatment that is appropriate for the client's assessed level of risk. We're going to talk about that in the risk needs responsivity. We're going to use empirically supported methods of intervention. And we're going to focus our treatment on research-supported dynamic risk factors, right? So things that scientifically have been shown to be associated with recidivism. Risk should be, okay. I'm going to dig into the risk needs responsivity model a little bit, and if anyone ever sees an evaluation that comes out of my office, this is at the end of those evaluations. Risk should be assessed for every person in a mandated setting using a validated static and dynamic risk assessment measures. The most common validated risk assessment measure that everyone uses is the static 99. There is no validated risk assessment measure for CSAM offenses. The CPORT is kind of, but it's not validated. It doesn't have enough science behind it. Dynamic risk measures are going to be things like the SOTIPs, the Stable 2007, the Acute 2007, again, researched, validated dynamic risk assessments. The risk needs responsivity model says, okay, higher recidivism risk, those people get more treatment, right? So they should be getting more intense treatment. They should be getting longer treatment. The low risk folks should be getting less treatment. And what the science has shown us is that, if we give the inappropriate intensity of services, that could potentially negatively affect treatment effectiveness. So if you take someone who's really, really a low risk for reoffending, and you put them in a group with really high risk people with a lot of treatment needs, we can actually make them worse. And so that's not something that people talk about a lot. And John just popped me a note to define CSAM. So CSAM is child sexual abuse materials. That's the language that we use for those cases. You might also hear CSEM, which is child sexual exploitation materials. So again, anyone who's going in for any kind of mandated treatment, you should have had a risk assessment. And that would let us know, based on what is your risk of recidivism, how much treatment and how intense should your treatment be. The needs, this is really your treatment planning, right? So what are your treatment targets going to be? And this is very individual, again, based on who you are, all of the other things going on in your life. What was your offending behavior? What is your current situation? It's not kind of a cookie cutter assessment. This is just some things that might be on a treatment in the needs. So, this is from the SOTIPs, are there problematic sexual behaviors that we need to work on? Is there a sexual compulsivity issue? Is there a minor attraction that we need to work on some coping mechanisms for? Are we impulsive? Are we cooperating with treatment? So there's lists of sort of what are all of these treatment needs. Things that could also be in here would be as if you have, say, some substance abuse issues or some gambling issues, or, we've got mental health issues or PTSD that might need to be addressed as well. So what are your specific treatment needs? And that's where your treatment plan gets developed. The responsivity piece, I think, has become absolutely more critical for me as an evaluator and as a treatment provider. And I really like this part of it. And so responsivity really means, how do I deliver treatment to you in a way that works for you, right? So we use evidence-based models, but I also have to look at, do you have responsivity factors? So what comes to mind is, if I have a client who's on the autism spectrum, I have to provide that client treatment in a way best suited to their symptomology for autism. If I have a client with a learning difference, with dyslexia as an example, if I have a client with like a visual processing issue, I need to make sure that I'm not just like giving handouts all the time and expecting them to read them when maybe they have that learning issue that means that they can't do that. So responsivity really is, how do I need to deliver treatment to you in a way that you can comprehend and you can get the most from that and be the most successful? And it's also building on your strengths, right? Building on your strengths and your motivations. So I hope that makes sense. To me, responsivity has become really important. And in our staffings, if somebody's like not getting something and we're kind of frustrated, we're often like, okay, are we not presenting this in a way that this person is understanding? Do we need to change our approach? How can we teach this concept perhaps in a way that they're going to understand better? Do they have a specific responsivity need? And I'm just going to check my question here. Okay. All right, John, I'm pausing for questions.
Okay, I think 3 questions that have come in. The first, you talked a lot about the assessment models. And I have a question. If someone has theoretically offended, but has never been charged or convicted and wants to get assessed or receive treatment, how does that work? What are the standards of needing history of offenses, mandatory reporting, etc.? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So, I mean, we're talking kind of specifically around the mandated treatment and things like that. So we have people that come in, you know, for other problematic sexual behavior, not necessarily offending behavior. We assess, you know, if somebody wanted to come in for an assessment, we could, you know, we do like a look or an able on people if they have a curiosity about their sexual interests, right? And if that's something that might be something that they want to work on, management techniques or shame reduction. The mandatory reporting laws are obviously something that we have to be very clear on. So if someone comes in and they say, I'm struggling with CSAM, right? Whether or not you report that depends on what state you're in, right? We do have some states, and Pennsylvania, is, I've been told, is one of them. Some folks will say it's not, you know, but so Pennsylvania is one of those states where if you say, I'm struggling with this, you know, type of pornography, you might end up with a mandatory report, right? Obviously, if someone discloses a history of, you know, sexually abusing a child, we are mandated to report that. So if there's, you know, hypothetical, you know, offending behavior, you know, you could come into treatment, you would just have to maybe parse your words, right? And be a little careful about what you say. Or, you know, just come in and say, I want to work on X, right? I want to work on, you know, my pornography addiction, or I'm, you know, I acknowledge that I have this sexual interest in pubescent children. How can I, you know, how can we work to manage that? I want to work to, you know, to overcome my shame around that behavior. And we would, you know, pick that treatment model. Does that answer the question, John?
I think so. Thank you.
Okay.
The next question is, I think we're going to get into this. I'm going to come back to this. The next question is, we've heard a lot, and PARSOL has put out information about the Good Lives model. And if you're going to get to this, wait for it. But what is the Good Lives model? Is it the same as the R&R model? Does it overlay? Do they conflict? What is that? And do SOAB treatment providers use it in their practice?
So I'm not sure if I get to it, but I'll just talk about it a little bit. So the Good Lives model is a strengths-based model as opposed to kind of a strictly a relapse prevention. So I'm going to paraphrase, and I apologize if I paraphrase badly. It kind of looks at, you know, the sexual offending behavior. What were we trying to get from that, right? Like, you know, what were we trying to get out of that? What was missing in life, right? That we ended up going down that road. This is a horrible paraphrase, I apologize. But it really works on helping people identify their own values, right? Where they want to be, and using their strengths to kind of get there and achieve those goals that mesh with their values. That's probably a better paraphrase. So it is not, I would say it's complementary to relapse prevention, but it's not going to necessarily be the same thing. And so our treatment providers can use this, right? It is an evidence-based practice. Whether or not they do use it is going to be up to each individual practice. It's not a SOAB mandate that says you have to use the Good Lives model, but, you know, the practice might use it based on their own, you know, their own treatment models.
Okay.
I'm sorry to butcher the Good Lives model.
I'm looking at your notes, which I also have a copy of, so you're going to get to the next question. So let's go on.
Okay, so I just put like a little risk needs responsivity in practice. As an example, we have Dan who comes in convicted of a CSAM offense, entering treatment because he's required CSAM individuals we know tend to be low risk. He fits the psychological profile, so he's a low risk individual. We're probably not going to, unless something else comes up, he's not going to have to do, years and years and years and years and years of treatment. He also has some other needs, some sexual compulsivity, alcohol abuse, generalized anxiety disorder, and hebephilia. So these are things that we would address as well in his treatment plan. Responsivity needs, he's on the autism spectrum, and so we would look specifically at, how we would need to help him through these based on his, how he learns best. So as an example of how that works. Okay, so I'm going to do this little chat. So the question is evaluating someone for SVP status considered a medical evaluation? If not, should it be, as a mental abnormality or personality disorder must exist to be determined for an SVP? Josiah? SVP is not a medical diagnosis. It is a statute-based determination. If you read the statute, so the main thing they're looking for is a mental abnormality, right? But in that print there, it does not have to be, they're not looking at a DSM-5 diagnosis. It is not an evaluation. It is not a diagnosis like you get with an evaluation. It is simply looking, and again, the state evaluator does not have to meet you, they just review your records. Do I think this person, in my professional opinion, meets the SVP criteria based on the 14 characteristics of that statute as it is laid out in law? Does that answer your question? That one's a hot button, and that's like a whole nother ball of wax. Okay. I'm going to skip that one. All right, so these are some things that John had tossed at me about advocating for yourself for treatment. Can you choose a treatment provider? That's going to depend. I think we talked about this, right? Are you getting DOC funding? It's going to have to be a DOC approved treatment provider. Does your probation dictate? Do you feel comfortable saying to probation, hey, I'd actually rather go over to treatment provider B than treatment provider A? Are you okay with that? Can I change treatment providers? So lately we've gotten a lot of people, I think as sort of the last chance who've been kicked out of other treatment providers, and will we take them? And a lot of times that's how treatment provider changes go, because someone gets discharged from treatment and they need a new one. But you do have the ability to ask, right? I would rather go here. How far you get with that, that's not me, right? That's probation that's going to dictate that. And I think there is a struggle a lot of times with people who are mandated to, how much do you want to rock the boat, right? Becomes that issue is that, how much do you want to advocate to yourself? Do you want to anger the powers that be, so to speak, because, they're in your life for quite a number of years. And so that really is just going to end up being a personal decision that each person who's mandated to treatment and maybe wants to change has to make, right? But, technically you're allowed to, you can ask, some probation is going to be much more flexible than others. You have a right to see your treatment plans. You have you should be seeing them. They should be being reviewed once a year. You have a right to report behaviors either as a client or as a clinician working that you find to be unethical. You can report them to the SOAB board. You can report them to the licensing board. There was another question I think that was emailed about medical records. Your chart is your medical record as a client. You have a legal right to your chart. So if you're asking for your chart, that is yours. We are legally obligated to provide you with that. If someone calls me and they say, hey, I want my chart, I have to give that to them. There is a clause that says we don't necessarily have to give that to you as the client if we feel like giving you your chart would cause damage or harm. I can only tell you what my attorney told me when I asked him about this, and he said the burden of proof for what would cause harm is so high that most of the time, you give the client their chart. It is their chart. It is their medical record. If there's names of family members and things like that, sometimes we will redact that because those are not people that are in therapy. We'll kind of get my FBI black ink out and redact names of, spouses or children or things like that. But your chart is your chart and you have a legal right to have it.
When you say could cause damage, is that to the client or
The client.
okay?
Yeah, not me, right? I should not be writing anything in your chart that could cause any damage to me, right? So it would be damage to the client. So, and like I said, that's, my attorney who specializes in therapy work said that that's a really, very difficult burden of proof, right? So basically 99.9% of the time, even if I wanted to say, I'm going to take this to court, I'm going to lose because it's your chart, it's your information. All right. We talked about this. I think group therapy, preferred evidence-based treatment. Individual therapy, if somebody's not a good fit for group, they can go to individual. Individual as an adjunct, right? We have lots of folks who maybe go to drug and alcohol counseling, maybe see an individual therapist for something we don't have someone who specializes in addition to their mandated treatment, couples therapy, right? So this is all, individual or couples therapy can be useful or helpful. It's mostly an adjunct, and SOAB and probation are not usually going to be okay with that being in lieu of your traditional group therapy. Again, collaboratively, I always say we play well in the sandbox with everybody. If you've got a substance abuse counselor and you've got a couples counselor and you've got a PTSD specialist, we want to sign releases so we can all be working together to provide you the best amount of care in a collaborative fashion. Polygraph. Okay, so I have another question about, is there a fee for a copy of a chart? So that's going to depend on the practitioner, right? So if you're actually asking for a printed copy of your chart, they have a right to charge you a nominal fee, right, for copying things. In the world of electronic medical records, right, we can just, for my practice at least, we can just download it and do an encrypted email if we wanted to, but the provider has a right to charge you a nominal fee to print out or to copy your chart. The polygraphs, we don't get around them, right? They are part of the containment model. They should be used for therapeutic purposes only. All right, hold on, let me check my chat. Okay, let me finish polygraphs and then I'm going to get to Alan's question. Polygraphs should be for therapeutic purposes. And again, this is out of the SOAB's principles. Programs should have the capacity to provide clinical polygraph testing as a measure of compliance and progress. It is a tool of treatment, right? So it is a treatment tool. How each program handles a failed polygraph, again, is up to that program, because as long as we follow those principles, we have a right to kind of create our own treatment programs within that. There is nothing in the standards, the SOAB standards, that say if you fail a polygraph, you are mandatorily discharged from treatment. That's going to be based on the policy of the treatment providers. In my program, if someone fails a polygraph, we dig into it, we try to figure out what's going on. If there continues to be struggles, maybe we do a therapeutic contract, but we personally don't kick people out of treatment if they fail a polygraph. We try to handle that therapeutically. I'm going to do this one before I get to Alan's question. So probation and parole officers in group. There is nothing, I know some places have probation and parole officers in group therapy. There's nothing in the SOAB standards that says that this is a normal or standard practice. We do not ever have probation and parole officers in our groups. If probation or parole wants to have a meeting with a client, we do that outside of group. I have some struggles with that personally, and this is just me personally. Is it still a therapy group if a probation officer is in there? If that probation or parole officer is in there, are they agreeing to hold up the therapeutic standard of confidentiality of the group that they sit in? What is their role in there? And then what do we do if the probation officer violates the therapeutic confidentiality of a group setting, right? Because as a therapy client, we have Pennsylvania particularly has very strong protections for your confidentiality, right? There are only a very small number of reasons why I can violate your confidentiality unless I have a release. And if I have a release for your probation officer, but a different probation officer is in group, I don't have a release necessarily for that probation officer. So this gets very complicated. And again, this is an individual treatment practices decision. Everyone has their own ways of doing things. Personally, I don't want probation or parole officers in group. For me, that's a therapeutic space when we all need to come together as a treatment team with probation, parole, therapy, and the client. We do that outside of the group setting. All right, I'm going to go back to my question. All right, so I have a question that says, Tier 1 with mandatory treatment titrated down to a 1 meeting per month. Is this considered maintenance or completion of treatment? And so to the person who gave me that question, I'm going to give you a horrible shrink answer and say, I don't know, right? So that's going to be dependent upon how your treatment program determines, like, did they say you have to stay in? Are they giving you therapeutic goals that you're working towards get through completion of treatment? And there's some counties, I'm just going to be very honest, we have one county that we work for. We can say therapeutically, this person is done. There's no reason for them to be in treatment anymore. And those probation officers will be like, they're in, and so a lot of times those are the folks that will go to what we call our alumni group. So I don't have a good answer for you, because whether that's considered maintenance or completion is going to depend on your treatment provider. But I think you have a right to ask, right? Like, what is my treatment plan? What are we working on? Is there a path to graduation? Is there a path to, completely finishing treatment, or am I going to be just a monthly? As part of the SOAB standards, anyone who is deemed to be an SVP, they are mandated to monthly treatment. But this person was a Tier 1, so legally there's no mandate to once a month treatment. I hope that answered that question. So some other things, PARSOL's legal folks are probably better at answering what actual laws, but there have been some recent legal findings or legal determinations that have made what is written on a person's sentencing sheet very, 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 very important. So, if you are a pre-sentence person and you need to use your internet for work, you need to see if you can get a judge on your sentencing sheet to say, can you use the internet for work? Or, you can have contact with your children, any of those types of things, if it's appropriate. But it becomes very important what is written on your sentencing sheet. We've had some folks come in recently that have had a hard time finding treatment providers who will abide by what's on the sentencing sheet. And again, every treatment provider has a right to have their own policies. Me personally, if the written court order from the judge says that you're allowed to use the internet, I'm not going to go against the judge's order. We work within the confines of what those judge's orders are, the sentencing sheets are. But as every provider is an independent company, they don't necessarily have to. So you can go in and they can say, I don't care what's on the judge's sentencing sheet, to be in treatment with my program, you have to abide by these rules. That is their right to do so, again, because they're independent. We're all independent businesses. But it becomes very important what's on your sentencing sheet. And I'm going to leave some resources up while I ask the truth. How long should mandatory treatment be? So I would say, I don't have like a 1 + 1 = 2 answer. If we're going by the risk needs responsivity model, right? So if you are a higher risk person, we're going to say you're going to need to be in treatment longer. If you're a lower risk person, you need to be in treatment for a shorter amount of time. That being said, we should also be doing dynamic risk assessments, right? Because if everything's going grand, we're moving towards discharge, and right, like we lose a relationship, we lose our job, and our dog dies, our dynamic risk goes up because that's just life. We have things, and maybe we need more treatment. So how long is not like I couldn't say like 18 months or this or that. And I think this is where it becomes really important to know what's my treatment plan, what are my treatment goals, what do I have to do, right, to move towards a successful completion of treatment. Is that, you know, here's the certain exercises, here's X number of polygraphs, here's, you know, so I don't have a good answer, but what I could say is that this is a place perhaps to advocate and say, what's my treatment plan? What am I working on here in treatment? What are my treatment goals? Is there a path to successful completion? And I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. Another question that's come in around polygraphs. If someone is convicted of a sexual crime that they did not commit and passes a sexual history polygraph to that effect, and then are still required to, quote, play along and admit guilt to satisfy their PO and treatment provider, how does that treatment plan work? And what do they do?
So I guess it would be, what is the treatment plan would be my question. So if we pass like a single issue polygraph or a denial polygraph and the polygraph says we didn't do it, we've said we didn't do it. This is, again, a place I'm really sorry I don't have a good answer, right? So depending on the treatment provider, you know, if we've got all of those things and it says you said you didn't do it, we took the conviction for the multitude of reasons that sometimes people do plead guilty, even if they didn't do it. We've passed the polygraph, we've got the evidence, you know, we would say, okay, you know, what is in that treatment plan? Are there other things that maybe you need to work on? We work through those. And for me personally, just me, my program, you'd be a shorter term treatment person, right? We'd work through whatever needed to be worked through and try to work with probation and say, right, like, this is not somebody who has a long list of treatment needs, right? That risk needs responsivity. We don't have a lot of treatment needs. Denial is kind of a hot button sometimes in treatment that, you know, way back in the day, like, you know, if you never admitted all of the details of your offense, you're put in a deniers group. You know, the research tells us that, you know, whether someone fully acknowledges their offending behavior or not doesn't really have an effect on recidivism. So, you know, again, it's each individual treatment provider and how they deal with the concept of denial. I'm frustrated for whoever sent that question in, because it's a very frustrating situation that, you know, if we're going to trust a polygraph, then we need to trust a polygraph. And so if you're passing the polygraph that says you're telling the truth, you're following all of your other treatment guidelines, you know, it's again the place where I would say, you know, actually, what is my treatment plan? What am I working towards here? You know, I'm not going, you know, and this is, do you want to play the game, right? This becomes the question. But it gets hemmed up. I've worked with folks who, not in group, but individually in many years past before we were approved, that, you know, had gone down that route and said, you know, yeah, okay, I did something that they didn't do. And then they end up failing the next polygraph, and it gets very complicated. So I don't have a good answer. And this is, I think that's one of the places where we get really stuck. And that would be, what's your dynamic risk? What's the treatment plan? Like, what are we doing here? And that's an unsatisfying answer as well.
Let's see, what's next? April is both Sexual Assault Awareness Month and Autism Awareness Month. In a report that's scheduled to be released later this month, which Dr. Weeks also contributed information to, we know that there's a high incidence of sexual offending behaviors in neurodivergent individuals. And you've already touched a little bit on this. Are there specialized treatment programs for that?
So I am not aware, at least in my region, which is the eastern region of Pennsylvania, of any treatment provider who specifically has a group for neurodivergence. JJPI in Philly has a group for intellectually disabled individuals. So it's becoming increasingly important, right, to have specialized treatment for people based on their needs. We've had even just in my practice, a large rise in folks that are neurodivergent coming in. And it means adjusting treatment. And, sometimes we have folks go into regular groups, sometimes we don't. And we really just try to look at that as a one-on-one basis. And honestly, part of my summer plan is to consult with a autism education specialist to see if we can work on some autism specific planning or neurodivergent specific treatment planning for our practice. But I'm hoping it's something that we're going to see soon, because it is very needed, and because the treatment needs and the responsivity needs of the neurodivergent, there are different, right? And we should not expect people with neurodivergence to necessarily do the things the way that the neurotypical folks do, or get mad at them because they don't, right? And so a lot of times, if we've got treatment, quote unquote, failures based on like homework issues and stuff, this is where that responsivity piece comes in. So I am not aware of what's maybe out in Western Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, if they have any autism or neurodivergent specific treatment plans. But that would be fantastic if we could move in that direction.
Thank you.
So I've got another question. Can I jump in on that one, John?
Sure.
So someone asked the difference between the static 99 and a dynamic risk assessment. So static risk assessments are based on things that cannot change: your age, the number of prior arrests you have, whether you lived with a partner for 2 consecutive years, whether you had a male contact victim, an unrelated contact victim. So the static 99 is a static measure of risk. That is based on things that do not change. It gives you a risk measure. If you read the manual, fundamentally that's valid for about 6 months after release from incarceration. We can't do anything about that. Dynamic risk assessments are based on things that can change, right? And so those could be changes in thinking, changes in attitude, or just changes in life, right? Unemployed, right? Do I get employed? Do I have stable housing? Do I have a good social network? What are my, how am I doing with my problematic sexual behavior? How am I doing with my fantasies? These are all things scientifically associated with risk, but that are changeable, right? And so what they say we're supposed to be doing, the people who make risk assessments, is to assess dynamic risk about every 6 months, right? Because life changes, right? Some 6 months are fantastic for us all, and some 6 months are kind of rough. And what's going on at the time affects our dynamic risk. So some of those dynamic risk pieces are treatment targets, right? Like if we have thinking distortions or impulsivity, these are things we can work on to help decrease dynamic risk, which is changeable risk. Some things we don't have a ton of control around, right? Like that's housing and employment and things like that. So the dynamic risk is changeable. Static risk we shouldn't be looking at, 6-8 months after you're out. If you were incarcerated, we should really be looking at dynamic risk. I hope that answers that question.
Thank you. We have a question about the fact that individuals in mandatory treatment sign a waiver that you can share information with their supervision, their PO, probation or parole. And
right.
If the crux of sound therapy is honesty, and a client is having sincere struggles with something that would be a parole violation, and making a distinction, I think, between parole violation and otherwise illegal behaviors, right?
Right.
Why would that client share that kind of information in therapy, knowing it would be shared with someone wearing handcuffs?
So, and I think I totally get that, right? There is, and that is one of the struggles of like, who's the client and doing mandated therapy, right? That you can choose not to sign a release of information for your probation or parole officer, which means you're probably not going to be in treatment, which is a whole nother ball of issues. But I think, again, that's going to be how you interact with treatment and how treatment interacts with probation. So we absolutely have people that are sharing, okay, looking at legal pornography, say, right? And so they have a mandate, part of their restrictions is they're not supposed to be looking at pornography. They're struggling with looking at pornography. We work with them around that, and we also work with parole. And maybe it's just, certain probation, that certain probation officers have a much more growth mindset around this. So a lot of this, I would say, is really around the relationships, right? So, we'll encourage people. We talk about it in group. We process it. Call your probation officer. Talk to them about it. Tell them that, okay, this is what happened. I had a relapse. I looked at pornography. We talked about it in group. Here's my plan to deal with it. Wanted to be honest and let you know. And again, I can only speak to my experience with the folks that we work with. Most of the time that goes over well, right? And no one's leaving in handcuffs. And again, we're not talking about reoffending or engaging in illegal behavior. But a lot of that comes down to trust and rapport, right? Which is a struggle in a mandated treatment setting.
Thank you.
Does that make sense, John?
Yeah. All right. Let's talk about the word addiction. Because your company is Sexual Addiction Treatment Services. We also have providers and people and we also, I should say, not to disclose anyone's personal identity, have a number of people here from different 12-step S programs. And so for them to go into an environment where they're told sexual addiction is not in the DSM-5, therefore it doesn't exist, and you should stop going to your meetings because they're a waste of time. What would you say on that? And can you talk a little bit about the debate over sexual addiction, and maybe it's just the terminology and we should be using impulse control disorder or something?
This makes me crazy, and I will tell you why. So it is on the ICD-11. It is compulsive sexual behavior disorder. It is a diagnosis in the ICD-11, which is the basically DSM for the rest of the world besides the United States. And so I'll tell you why this thing always makes me crazy. Sex addiction doesn't exist. Pornography addiction doesn't exist, right? But in the motivations facilitation model of sexual offending by Michael Cito, guru in this field, fantastic man, fantastic researcher. One of the motivations someone could have for sexual offending is high sex drive, which he says also called sexual compulsivity, sexual addiction. If you look at a number of the dynamic risk assessments, it will talk about sexual compulsivity, those actual words, using sex as coping, right? Using sex as affect regulation. And what are all of those things, right? But the same as what some people would call sexual addiction. So I think it's a semantic thing. No, it's not in the DSM. It's in the, it's in the ICD-11. But it is fundamentally the same thing as sexual compulsivity, which is a recognized dynamic risk factor. So, I mean, if they tell you it's a waste of time and you find it helpful and useful, we can thank them for their opinion, right? And you can do those things on your own, right? You can do the workbooks, you can do the readings. If you're allowed to go to meetings, there's really no reason you shouldn't be. Even people with restrictions for minors, I've never known there to be, small children at a S meeting, right? So these should be, if that's something you find helpful for your own recovery, why not?
Okay. You mentioned.
Sorry, I could soapbox on that one forever, but I won't.
Yeah, we are almost at our time. You had mentioned that sometimes the DOC provides funding for treatment or pays the bill for that. Do you know anything about how that works? We have some, we have people who I will say, when we did our winter survey of PARSOL members, 94% of respondents were underemployed or unable to find employment. And if they were paid under the table and not able to get benefits. And typically this kind of treatment isn't covered under insurance.
Right.
So how do they pay for this? I mean, this is not an inexpensive venture.
Absolutely. So the Department of Corrections funding is for people coming out of state prison. And they usually will fund treatment for the first year, the mandated treatment for the first year once you're released from state prison. And then sometimes there's an option to renew that if the person still needs to be in treatment and is struggling to get employment. So that would be somebody on state parole that would have, their treatment could be funded by the Department of Corrections. And that would be, you would talk to the parole officer about that.
Yeah. Speaking of state, you are also, SATS is also a provider for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania in the federal supervision system. Yeah. And is there a difference between state treatment plans, state regulations, and federal ones? Obviously, it's, state is SOAB. Federal, does that use SOAB? Does that use other criteria?
So, you know what? I've never actually officially asked, but the feds that we've worked with do want people to go to a state-approved treatment provider. So they kind of basically, from my experience, are kind of using the state rules and regs and guidelines. The feds sometimes have some different rules around, polygraphs or things like that. But for the most part, it is very similar. Your guideline, your restrictions or your guidelines on federal supervised release or probation or parole for the state or the county. It's very similar.
Okay. I know you and I have talked about this, and we've looked at this in our neurodivergence report, talking about polygraphs and their appropriate use and their mandated use. What if somebody is not a candidate for polygraphs? We know that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities might have a different neurophysiology that would just cause polygraphs to either always pass or always fail, regardless of what they say. Can you talk about the appropriate use, or I guess I should say inappropriate use?
So, full disclosure, I do teach for the Northeast Drug Task Force Polygraph School. I ask the polygraphers this question all the time. I'm like, where's the data? What do you got? And they kind of like, Jen, I don't know. So I am not aware of, doesn't mean it doesn't exist, of any research looking at the use of the polygraph specifically with neurodivergent individuals. When I'm teaching, and the folks that I'm teaching are usually actually current law enforcement, so not your peace out guys. I've started to spend a lot of time talking about polygraphs with neurodivergent people, right? They're probably going to do them anyway, right? Because they're doing it for investigative purposes or whatever. I have no control over that. I can maybe give them some information. So we talk about, sensory processing issues, right? If you've got someone who has a tactile sensory processing issue as a neurodivergent individual, well, what are we doing in a polygraph, right? We're like strapping them onto things and we've got things attached to them, and that can be very difficult for them. What's the lighting, what's the smells? So I don't know of any data. There might be some out there about neurodivergent individuals and polygraphs. When I teach about it, I really want those law enforcement officers to understand that there's a lot going on, that if you're going to even try to do this test, you need to be thinking about not taking comfort items, about asking very clear questions, about any type of sensory processing issues, about, issues with echolalia, where maybe somebody repeats exactly what, the person said to them. It's newer in the offending world, right? For us to have this larger number of neurodivergent individuals, and the research just isn't there. So I don't have a good answer for that one, John. You're making me feel like I don't have good answers for a lot of things.
All right. Well, here's your last question, and You'll have an answer for this. Well, you have two questions. The first is, before we have a closing statement, we'll call it your closing statement. If you can go to your next slide, if people are interested in contacting you, learning more about SATs, maybe switching providers, maybe finding out about things like that, what do they do?
So if you have questions, information from here, questions about treatment, so my email is there, jweeks@satshealing.com. The website, the 610 number is our office, and the second email is Jonathan, who's our amazing office manager. We have an office in Plymouth Meeting, Pennsylvania, as well as in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. We do individual and group therapy there. So if you have questions, if you are curious, if you have questions that you know, we didn't get to during this, just give me a call and let me know, or shoot me an email is probably better. But we're always happy to help folks in any way that I can. As you can tell from some of my answers, we don't always have good answers for things, but we can try to help direct you as best as we are able.
Okay. Just so everybody knows, we are a little over time, so I'm just going to wrap up with my piece here and say that we did record tonight's session. I will try to get it out to everybody who was here with audio snafus and all within
Sorry about that.
within the next 24 hours. So you'll get the raw, unedited, whatever. And many of you made generous donations to be here. We want to respect your contribution and time tonight. We will eventually post this on our YouTube channel, probably in about 45 to 60 days. But meanwhile, you will have access to this. I would let you know that the Fearless Support Group that meets next, not tomorrow, the next Saturday at 4 o'clock. You can get information on the parsol.org website about that. We'll be discussing treatment programs and people's experience in there using some of the talking points from this. And so that will be next Saturday at 4. Any other, I want to thank everybody for attending. We've got 25 people still here out of our 27 who we started with, so that's a pretty good retention over an hour and a half, especially with audio issues and craziness. I want to thank very much Dr. Jennifer Weeks for, number one, your support, your participation on the PARSOL Advisory Board, and presenting tonight. And I want to give you an opportunity to deliver any closing remarks you have to the people in the room, reminding that we have a lot of people who are in treatment programs or have been in treatment programs. We have some treatment providers. We have some professional folks here. And we also have a number of folks here that have joined from other affiliates with the parsols of other states, we'll call them. So anything you'd like to say to that audience?
So for those from out of state, all of these rules and regs and guidelines should be a very quick Google search, right? So I talked about Pennsylvania because that's where I am. I think for everybody else, I appreciate your time. I appreciate you coming and listening to me chatter about this. That, you know, I think we're evolving, right? The practice of treating people who've committed sexual crimes and mandated treatment is evolving. The pace at which is evolving is not always uniform. But if you're kind of a research evidence aware kind of practitioner, we're evolving. We're always trying to learn. We're always trying to do better things. And so, you know, other things you can do is, you know, check out the ATSA website and, you know, their YouTube channels or things like that, because they're going to have information from the researchers and the leading cutting edge people all over the world that are doing this work, that are doing the evidence-based work. And I think nowhere ever does it say that we are not supposed to treat our clients with dignity and respect, and the same dignity and respect that we would treat all of our other clients. And I think that's all I have to say.
Awesome. Once again, thank you everyone for coming tonight. Once again, you'll get an email in a day or so, or maybe sooner, with the recording of this. I'm going to click a button here, maybe. All right. I'm going to ask everyone to unmute, and let's give Dr. Weeks a hearty round of applause for joining us tonight.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Leave meeting.
Oh.
I'm still on the phone.